I'm kind of always interested in the title Creative Mornings. It's my mornings are creative, but it's only because I don't speak. And I'm usually like a horrible mess, and it takes me about 5 coffees and probably a few cigarettes to actually get going. So if nothing makes sense, call me after 3 and I'll explain it all to you. So this is the middle class pool. It's a project I did probably about 10 years ago for a client. It's it's a pool of sorts. It was kind of interesting in a sense that I kind of got to a point in the project where I was just late at night, not really kind of feeling it, and I decided to like put a body in the pool. A dead body. I thought at the beginning it was a swimming body, but it's sort of grey and featureless. And it kind of, when I presented this to the client, not this exact image, but pretty close to, it kind of made me, they didn't actually see anything. They didn't comment to me about the body in the pool. And I know that from my point of view, it was like, taking it a step too far, but I just was interested in that kind of proposal. Like, why didn't they see this, Did they feel too polite to say, Were they just focused on what they wanted to see, the aesthetics of the middle class pool? In some way, this is kind of representative to me of the problem. It's sort of a lack of accountability, a lack of architectural criticism, or creative criticism in New Zealand right now, and this is relevant to everybody. People aren't really looking deeper on the surface of what is aesthetically pleasing, beautiful, or cute. Aspects which in themselves are dictated to us and our neighbours, by our neighbours, media, and the context of the global creative community. I thought this is actually quite a good slide for aesthetics. It's actually from my gram, but I just thought that, in a sense, like, as architects, this is all we've got. We know about order, We know about how to kind of organize things neatly. It's kind of the last bastion of kind of Vitruvius, it's delight, firmness, and commodity, We've lost the other two. Are we just arbiters of aesthetics and style? Is this all we have control over? Socks on the table. What happened to our ability to create value through an understanding of social, economic, and political insight? The connections which provide a richer understanding of the work we produce. Critique is seen as judgment, when it should be seen as a way of placing ourselves within the context of who we are in terms of history, culture, and identity. Architecture in New Zealand needs critical writing in order to grow, because if you're not growing, you're dying. This guy's a critic. This is a project I did on Matiatia Bay probably about 10 years ago, and he's a politician on Waiheke. He's a blogger for whale oil, believe it or not. And not to say that he's the final bastion of critical thinking, but he called the house a crime against humanity, a crime against pleasantness, which was interesting. He's actually kind of good. He wrote like a large article about architecture and beauty. And at the end he says that architect, if he knew, chose not to understand beauty. But I can also be critical of this guy because he found himself in some problematic proposition. But I mean, he, in a sense, is important. And I think the thing is like, why are these guys talking about our work? Why do they have to talk when nobody else does? This is actually a quote by Jeremy Till. I think he's a really great writer. He kind of talks about contingency in architecture. And in that sense, as creatives, you could read it as, are we, being pure of intent, corrupted by commercial constraints? Or, as Jeremy Till believes, we don't admit that architecture is a messy endeavor, that it doesn't respond to absolute control. I personally see it as that too. This lack of criticism allows a kind of freedom to speculate without fear of repercussion. In the absence of accountability, we are left to find other ways of expanding the conversation. In a way, for me, the speculative project became the kind of answer for that lack of criticism. It's sort of self-indulgent, sort of a self-critique. It's productive in the sense of expanding our own agenda that is unable to be played out in the everyday production and practice. So we did a few projects, which I did with a friend of mine, Simon Glaister, and also my practice. We talk a lot about these projects, and they sort of have this ability to go way beyond where they started, which is a really kind of interesting thing to me. This is a project we did for the Venice Biennale. This is the drawing that actually never was presented, but it was the kind of driving force between what we did. It sort of was a failed proposition for the Venice Biennale. We actually was never talked about, but we actually entered, and we wanted this thing to be floating in the water in Venice. So in some way, I'm not sure, somehow it kind of ended up as part of the process. So we went through this project, and it kind of has this kind of density to it in a sense. So much going on that you could talk about it for hours, but I won't. The drawing, in a way, kind of, as an architect, the drawing is kind of an interesting proposal. It's how we communicate it as architects. And we're interested in the way that we could kind of take that, the exactness of CAD, and take it to the extreme, fill dimensions with a kind of narrative and a critique and a discussion of, who we are as a country and how we see ourselves. So there was a sort of a massive amount of appropriation that went on. As the project kind of went along, we just couldn't stop, and the drawing sort of gives you that sense. It's like full of text, as well as just CAD. It's this idea about, in some sense, about holding a mirror up to who we are. But also, it just rolls out a lot of critique about tourism, politics, architecture. It's the actual whole plan is based on the Philip Johnson glasshouse and how modernism has become this kind of generic proposition in New Zealand. We sort of overloaded cultural icons. We continued to envelop them and develop them, take pieces and rework them. This became like a long production. We had a lot of people helping us making the whole project. The middle slide is actually of a uranium pool, and we sort of rolled that out as this kind of crossover between uranium pool and this kind of recreational pool. There was something about the water, that's beautiful but also disgusting and problematic. We looked at extraction of resource. The thing that kept the pavilion afloat were oil cans, discarded oil cans. We used some math field, because math field's great. We create the little tables on the left-hand side there, all made out of panamu with little stainless steel frames, and they sit as Philip Johnson glasshouse. The actual furniture in the house, they sit on the pavilion itself. It was sort of this exacting fabrication. My friend Steve Brookbanks, big shout out to that guy, he's an incredible fabricator. We had a guy that made the smallest neon he's ever made. And then we kind of got this interesting social media confusion. We got a lot of likes from Vogue Italia, which was kind of really interesting. But in some way, it was interesting that we got Vogue Italia, but in New Zealand, this idea it sort of became this thing that was in the background. We never talked about it again, kind of thing, which was interesting. Sort of that, to me, is an interesting image in terms of just kind of walking past, sort of looking at it, This thing was sort of sitting in a corner beyond the Future Islands exhibition in its own little kind of space with this dodgy red light that kind of flickered on and off. Not really aesthetically pleasing, just what it is, a restaurant. We did make it to the cover, but I opened it up and I was like, it didn't actually say anything about the pavilion. So these are some of the people that worked on it, Steve Brookbanks. It's yeah, an interesting proposition that nothing happened with it, you know, and in a way Simon and I want to take it in another direction, you know, at some stage if we can. This is another proposal we did. We were invited by Paperboy, and big shout out to Jeremy Hansen because he's great that he does this, I think. It's really important to do a proposal for the America's Cup. And it was, again, this interesting problem, like, you know, what would you do for the America's Cup? And we ended up creating this drawing, which was the exact opposite of what everybody else did. It was ended up being these kind of quite aesthetic proposals, renderings of you know, pavilions floating down in the viaduct. Whereas in a way we kind of thought, hey, we'll go the other way. It was kind of like a Robin Hood of the America's Cup. We sort of took it to the Manukau Harbour. And in doing that, it set up an incredibly dense narrative. We sort of looked at ideas about canals cutting through Tamaki and the Faux River, which were actually historical proposals. These proposals we amalgamated and then turned Auckland into a new island, which in itself, you know, we could become the Venice of the Pacific, you know. So everything that happens when you go the other way is kind of interesting because what it sets up is all these other proposals, you know, ferries going everywhere from the Auckland airport, new Onehunga Stadium. But probably more importantly, it actually set up the idea of potential for housing, you know, all of this new land that you create when you create a canal or a river becomes, you know, more valuable, and in a sense we could make this thing become public housing. You could densify those edges. The interesting thing as well is that, which we have never taken it to, but we kind of like the idea of, and if there's any economists in the room, it'd be really great, is that we thought that in a way to actually finance this proposal, perhaps we, you know, would have new shipping lanes. So perhaps you'd get rid of the container terminal, you'd have this ferry system, you'd have all this new public housing, you'd take the America's Cup to the Manukau Harbour, although I've been told that there's no way it can go there. So it's the importance of this proposal, though, is not that it's impossible to do. It's just the idea of speculating about it and what it means. And I think the America's Cup is, as we've seen probably recently in the paper, has become this kind of thing that is now sort of generic and gentrified. And I kind of think that to fight it is good, to think about it is good. And no, we just don't do this as creatives. We don't sit outside into these kind of realms of thinking about all the other propositions that we can do. This is actually my last slide. So in a way, it kind of all comes back to death. And I guess it's interesting to me, this is a Bernard Schumi advertisement for architecture from the 70s. And again, it sort of shows that sort of frustration, I guess, in a sense, you know, that architecture has this incredible power that we don't engage with. And how do we look at criticism as not a negative, but, you know, a positive in that idea, that we find a way to start thinking about things more deeply. You kind of get to that point as an architect after practicing for a long time, and you kind of think, I'm not sure if I can do many more ensuites and walk-in wardrobes, you know? And I know how to do them. I can do a damn good ensuite and a damn good walk-in wardrobe. But I think that architecture and creative thinking has this incredible power that we just aren't trusted with. You know, it's currency in the media, you know, like in the newspaper, there's talk of development, a new building going up, but they never discuss who the architect is. It's like we're afraid to be found out. And it's kind of that accountability that requires us to develop who we are, you know. So that's about it. That's all I've got. Death to death. Sometimes I probably kind of like want to find a way of doing this. And we sort of talked a lot when I was up north just recently with a guy that's a pretty smart guy, works for iwi, for Ngāti Kuri. And we talked a lot about this idea and how we can find a way in. And one of the things they talked about, we talked about speculative projects as a way, but, self-indulgent. But, perhaps, competition work would be another way of expanding that. I know that in New Zealand, like I'm always like, man, I want to do a competition, and I never get to that point to be able to do it because it just kind of doesn't exist. It exists everywhere else in the world, but it doesn't happen here. And in a way, like maybe that's perhaps the next step. Maybe we can find, or people need to find a way of kind of going. Maybe competition is a way of allowing that discussion to occur. I'm sure there's a lot of people that would say they're critical writers in New Zealand, but maybe that judgment, that accountability can be seen through competition proposals, open competition proposals. In a way, the Venice Biennale kind of was that, and we lost. And I don't feel good about it. But yeah. Anyway, that's all I've got.